There is no doubt the Great European Famine caused Europe much death and desolation. Now, it should be investigated if famine had occurred during the same period in other regions, especially in Asia, to see if the Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317 indeed is only a part of the prophesied event in Revelation 6 verse 8, hunger that killed, over the fourth part of the earth, a vast portion of the world. It is not far-fetched to think the probability would be low to have such large-scale famine that devastated nearly all Europe would have also appeared in Asia during the same period. Considering that the scripture of the fourth seal mentions hunger prior to death, the famine clearly has to have occurred before the Black Death. And the likelihood of history revealing itself in such order of occurrence may not necessarily be high. If accounting for Europe alone, there is a probable chance, however, to include China into the equation, the probability lessens quickly. In Europe, the Great European Famine occurred in 1315, which is earlier than 1348, when the Black Death had spread. But is this the case for China and India? Research below shows that the rare possibility of having European, Asian, and Indian regions experiencing an extensive famine before the Black Death had actually been a reality. Both historical phenomena affected a vast portion of Earth, over the fourth part of the Earth. In an article published in the National Geographic magazine, a famine in China was discussed. Quote, China is another land which famine seems to have marked for its own. Existence is a perpetual struggle for food in the Celestial Empire, and the smallest deviation from a maximum yield destroys the margin of safety between barely enough and starvation. The 4 years between 1333 and 1337 constituted a period of unimagined suffering throughout China, and it is highly probable that it was in this era that the seeds of disaster were sown for Europe's Black Death, which appeared in the following decade. Famine and pestilence laid the whole country waste. According to Chinese records, 4 million people perished from starvation in the neighborhood of Qiang alone, unquote. In sum, the famine in China contributed to the start of the plague in Europe. Another section titled Famine's Terrible Toll in India discusses Indian famine as follows. Quote, in the ancient chronicles of Indian courts little space is given to the sufferings of the common people, hence the early accounts of famine are meager, but occasionally a single sentence from a poem or a historical sketch is illuminating in its very brevity. For example, we find the line, the flesh of a son was preferred to his love, grimly suggesting the practice of cannibalism in times of dearth, while at about the time that the Black Death was making its appearance in Europe a famine of such severity swept over Hindustan, unquote. The famine in India during this period refers to 1335 to 1342, and the records show it had impacted the northern India, including Delhi. Other records reveal the famine that had started in 1344 continued for years, decimating the population of Doab. From 1344 to 1345, India suffered the Great Famine, and even the emperor and his family could not escape hunger. With the famine lasting for years, the death toll due to starvation reached millions. In summary, this famine had begun in 1335 and reached its peak intensity between 1344 and 1345. Any list of famines available from an encyclopedia would yield the Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317, Famine of China from 1333 to 1337, and the Great Famine of India from 1344 to 1345, in this chronological sequence. The Great European Famine affected vast regions, including parts of Russia. Research confirmed the famine had not only swept through Europe and Russia, but also China and India as well, before the Black Death peaked in Europe in 1348. In case of China, the plague had peaked in 1353 to 1354 while the famine had occurred from 1333 to 1337. Thus, the famine had appeared prior to the plague. In case of India, the famine had occurred from 1335 to 1345. The regions affected by the extensive famines share common regions impacted by the Black Death, but they are not entirely the same. As discussed previously, the famine that began in China from 1333 to 1337 probably contributed to the emergence of the Black Death in Europe by increasing the vulnerability of people to the virulence of the Black Death in the commonly affected regions. Being contagious in origin, the pestilence spread throughout a quarter of Earth. Each area killed with sword, hunger, and death by the beasts of the earth may not be exactly the same in location. The regions affected by the devastating famines were extensive to cover the fourth part of the earth that death and hell had power over in killing, with hunger.